Secretary, thank you so much for being here with us today. So you're a unique figure in American politics. You were a Republican senator nominated by a Democrat president to serve as Secretary of Defense. Some of your colleagues were thrilled about it, some less so. You had the experience of serving both on the legislature and in the executive branches. You were uniquely bipartisan or nonpartisan in a very partisan age. And you were Secretary of Defense at a pivotal time in global history. And that gives you a unique position to address the three themes in the very short time we have that I would like to touch on. The first will be the changing strategic environment that we're facing. Second one will be more internal DoD leadership questions. And the third is the role of us as lawyers in national security policy making and policy implementation. So let's start with the first, if you please. When you came into office, ISIS wasn't really a big thing, or we didn't appreciate the threat it would become. Syria was embroiled in a civil war, but the Russians weren't involved yet. They hadn't invaded Crimea yet. The Iran nuclear deal wasn't made. And you had a front seat to all these challenges as they were unfolding. Let's start with ISIS. Did we appreciate the threat correctly? And here, in our strategy where we denied them territorial and economic assets, did we do enough on the cyber front and on the social media presence front?
Well, thank you. And I also want to thank the law school and the benefactor, Rita Hauser, and her husband, Gus. Rita and I have served together on a number of boards over the years, and I have the highest regard for her and great admiration.
As do I.
Plus, I just like her. She's very clear, very direct, as you know. In a world that sometimes is a little bit unclear, she has never suffered from that malady. Thank you all for giving me a little time. I really appreciate an opportunity to say hello and get a little bit of your feedback, and appreciate a little more your thinking about the world and what's going on, and your role in a dynamic, volatile, uncertain world that I suspect is not going to, at least anytime soon, get any less volatile and less uncertain. I was talking to my brother, one of my brothers who served with me in Vietnam in 1968, Tom, this morning. It's his birthday today. And he just retired after 35 years as a law school professor at Dayton University in Ohio. He's now a municipal judge, but he still teaches. So he was very concerned to learn that I was going to be sharing any time with students at Harvard Law School, that he said he now thinks less of Harvard's law school for having me. So no reputable, admired educational institution would allow you to come through their doors, he told me. But old age hasn't changed him. He's a younger brother. But and I have, because of Tom and other friends of mine over the years, have had many opportunities to talk to law schools and law students. Even gave some commencement speeches at some when the standards were lower on speakers. Now, to your question, I mean, I think you framed up three generally very important questions, because within the three, and I'll answer the first, I think really fits most of the big issues and the challenges to our country and what the world is dealing with. I think you have to start with, at least in my opinion, what I believe is the redefining of a world order. We're seeing, after 70 years, a post-World War II order start to melt into a different kind of an order. History is replete on these kinds of things. It doesn't mean you disband or retreat from the last 70 years of what the world has worked within. But like nature, like life, like everything, nothing stays the same. There is no such thing as status quo. Everything shifts, everything changes. And in institutions, whether they're a kind of an ill-defined, nebulous so-called world order, they must change and shift as well in order to be relevant to what's going on in the world. And you see the astounding dimension of technology that has shifted everything and has propelled a rate of change that the world has never seen before. Demographic shifts, which we've never ever had to deal with. The greatest diffusion of economic power ever in the world. And all those dynamics are now in play that has really, in many ways, unlocked unpredictable forces, which some of those are dangerous forces, which gets to the ISIS question. ISIS was born out of many different dynamics. I think understanding the historic contours, and many of you do far better than I do, of the Middle East. The centuries-old religious conflicts, cultural, ethnic, tribal, post-colonial authoritarian consequences. We're still seeing consequences of that play out. And when you've got a technology that we have today that unlocks all that so that people can communicate and actually in real time see pictures and all the other changes, has now set in motion frustrations, anger, unfairness, all that in many ways has been centered in that part of the world. And when you look at the world order of the last 70 years, most of the world has done pretty well as a result of that world order. Middle East is a good example of one of the primary areas that was left behind. Other than Israel, you're still living in a tribal world where you have authoritarian governments, whether they be monarchies or military dictatorships. And the people of that region have been captive to that. And they've not had the opportunities to do new things in jobs and education. And that's partly religious, it's partly cultural, it's partly tribal. But all that's shifting now, and it is presenting a huge challenge to the world. The advent of ISIS, I think, has to be recognized for what it is, and as I just said, I think all those dimensions that I mentioned are part of what has propelled ISIS. Terrorism is not new. I mean, terrorism has been around since man has been around.
Are you suggesting a response is being too military-oriented?
I think the military response to ISIS is but one part of a response. Until you get underneath the causes and recognize, well, what was it that projected and propelled, whether it's Al-Qaeda or al-Nusra or offshoots of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, what propelled this? How did this happen? This just did not happen. Something occurred over a process, over a time, that allowed this to happen. The military is an instrument, but the military has to be used within the context of a much larger diplomatic, political framework of policy. You can't lead with the military. You can't shock and awe countries into liberalism, into recognizing human rights. We tried that, and that hasn't worked very well for the last 15 years. The military is an enforcer, as are other factors, economics, trade, cultural relationships, of foreign policy. So I think it's the combination of those things that have brought ISIS to force. Specifically, when ISIS crossed the border, the Syrian border, in early 2014, it wasn't that ISIS was not on our radar scope of the intelligence communities. It was isolated, and obviously what was happening in Syria also was part of allowing the formation and the power of ISIS. But what happened in Iraq was because the western part of Iraq, and many of you know that area well, or some may be from that area, is predominantly Sunni. And the government that eventually came into power after we invaded Iraq became a government not of co-equal branches, but of sharing power. The Sunnis had positions, the Shia majority had positions, and the Kurds. But I watched Maliki, the prime minister, really squander and undo much of what the power-sharing constitution was about in essentially disbanding Sunni involvement and stripping Sunnis of senior leadership in the military and in functioning government institutions. That brought right back into focus the Sunni-Shia split. Obviously, you all know that Iraq is a Shia-dominated country, aligned internally very closely with Iran. Maliki was close to the Iranians. al-Badi is close to the Iranians. So what occurred was a systematic delegitimization of the Sunnis' power base. And so when ISIS crossed the border, and by the way, not in great force, 2 divisions of Iraqi forces dropped their weapons and ran. 2 complete divisions, trained by the United States in Iraq, armed by the United States. ISIS then walked into Mosul and other towns in western Iraq, took over the armories filled with American weapons, raided the banks, took control of the cities. And initially, the Sunnis basically, maybe not necessarily embraced ISIS, but said, this is better than what we've been living with under the Shia-dominated Baghdad government. That was really much the beginning of the power of ISIS, and why now many forces are combining to try to drive ISIS, and they will, ISIS out of Mosul and continue to push ISIS out of Iraq. But that is not going to solve some of the most basic problems that underlie this issue.
So our involvement in Syria, you mentioned the move of ISIS to Syria, and that also has to do with the world order of the last 70 years, or at least
Yes.
the first 45 years after World War and now. Is our, I think it's fair to say, hesitance in Syria opened the door for the Russians to come in, and is that troubling both for the future of Syria and for the future of U.S.-Russia relationship?
Well, I do think our lack of clarity on a Syria policy, in my opinion, no question, affected the decisions of the Russians to essentially just blatantly inject themselves militarily in Syria. And I think probably the defining dynamic of that was the president's ultimate decision after we had made the decision on the red line, chemical weapons, to go forward as President Obama had promised, essentially, in a news conference, that would be the red line. He made it very clear early on his position, our foreign policy position, Assad must go, but we never did anything to back that up, which put in question America's commitment to that with our allies in that area. But the president was very clear, we're not at war with Syria, but Assad must go. So there was always kind of a contradiction in what the president was, our policy, and then the fulfillment of carrying through on that. But the real defining point was when the president said, if in fact Assad uses chemical weapons on his own people, there'll be consequences for that. After we went through painstakingly significant international reviews to the UN that, in fact, Assad's forces did use chemical weapons against his own people more than once, then the president asked for options, military options, other options on what action he could take. We, National Security Council, decided on one approach, and which I think was the right approach. It was unanimous. The president said, okay. It was a big operation. Within hours, the president pulled it down. Now, when a president of the United States says something, and that's our policy and our word, it means something. And not only does it mean something to our allies, but our adversaries. Our adversaries watch this very, very carefully. And I think probably when that happened, I think Putin made the very clear calculation that, and the Russians had been shut out of the Middle East for 40 years, and all they had was that small little Mediterranean naval base in Latakia province at Tartus, which was really nothing. He used that and then made the calculation that the United States would not interfere. And so now the Russians are heavily involved in Syria. I don't think they're going anywhere. They have regained a foothold in the Middle East, which they've been shut out of for 40 years. And with the continued volatility in Egypt and other countries, and then with a loose association with Iran for a common purpose of using Assad for their own interests, both Iran and Russia, this is a pretty difficult situation. And you've got all these different players now in Syria militarily. I mean, think for a moment in this little space, country called Syria, you've got Russian military all over the place. America is there. We've got boots on the ground, and we've been flying sorties there by the thousands with some of our NATO partners and GCC partners. You've got the Turks now in Syria with their army. You've got the Iranian-sponsored Hezbollah and other proxies, Shia militia in Syria, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra. That's a pretty combustible, toxic brew in that little country. And so the threat of some kind of confrontation somewhere is pretty clear, and something will happen unless this is pulled apart in some way. And the last point I'd make, I don't think you can take Syria or Iraq and isolate on those two countries as separate kind of things. Yes, they're indigenous to each. This is a regional problem. Yemen, Saudi Arabia, obviously Libya, across the Mediterranean. What just happened in Lebanon the last 2 days, I don't think is good news. I think that gives more influence to Iran, shuts Saudi Arabia more out of it, and with the Sunni side of it. Obviously, Iraq's going to continue to have problems. Syria. This is a regional issue as much as any one country.
So in the prioritizing, when the president announced at the time that we should pivot to the Asian Pacific region and that should be the focus of our strategy building for the next couple of decades, is that still the case, or is the Middle East going to draw more of our attention and resources?
Well, anytime a country is at war, and in fact we are at war because we have boots on the ground and we are running military sorties in a war zone, and we are taking casualties. And then you add that to Afghanistan to that, and that's not going particularly well. Taliban control more territory in Afghanistan now than they have any time in the last 15 years. So anytime a nation has troops on the ground and is involved in a war, that's your first priority. It has to be. Now, that doesn't mean you retreat from any other part of the world, or you have the luxury of saying, well, we'll get to Asia Pacific when we have time. It doesn't work that way, not for the United States. So, but your priority has to be where your troops are, where war is. So the next president is going to be confronted with an astoundingly long agenda and difficult and complicated of these issues. Asia Pacific will continue to remain a significant part of our interest. We've been a Pacific power since the beginning of our country. The entire tip from north to south, the tip to the bottom of the Western Hemisphere, borders the Pacific. So our interests are clearly in the Pacific, but that doesn't mean we're retreating from any other part of the world, nor should we, in my opinion, nor can we. Europe, the Middle East. So it's a balance, and this is why alliances become, again, critically important. Alliances, the strength of alliances, and building new partnerships based on what these smart, wise, amazing men and women after World War II did to build this new world order. They built a world order based on coalitions of common interests. We focused on our common interests, not where we disagreed or differed. We'll sort that out, but unless you have a platform to work from, you'll have another world war, and the next one won't be quite like the first two, if that ever happens.
So I want to move to the second theme of DoD leadership. In 2015, Forbes magazine gave the statistics that the third largest employer in the world is Walmart with 2.1 million employees. The second is the People's Liberation Army in China with 2.3 million employees. And the biggest was the DoD with 3.2 million employees. So what's it like to be the world's biggest employer?
Well, I was just part of it, but I think the first thing you always recognize anytime you have the privilege of leading any institution, but something as big and complicated as DoD is, first of all, you recognize very quickly, or you must, how little control you have of it all. And I've described the DoD often as an empire within empires within empires. And it's like leadership management anywhere in any institution. It's people. It's building relationships of cooperation. First day I was at the Pentagon in February of 2013, I spent the day going around to all the offices at the Pentagon of each chief of each service, each senior enlisted of each service, all the undersecretaries, assistant secretaries, and the secretaries of the services.
It's a long day.
It was a long day, all day, and I didn't have them come to me because people say, "Oh no, Mr. Secretary, we'll come to your office." No, I'll come to your office. I want to see if you have a better office than me. So, but I did that very, very intentionally because I want to send a message to the entire empire the first day that the new Secretary of Defense was always going to reach out and listen, and I wanted all of them to be part of this, that I would not make any decision without them, those senior leaders. I said, we may not always agree, but there will be no decision that I ever make or any recommendation I take to the President of the United States without your involvement, without your voice, and then we'll work it out. And I think that's probably the essence of wise management leadership in any institution. And I mean, not only was it a great privilege to do that, and every job I've ever had, whether it been in the Senate or whatever it's been a privilege, but you have to recognize, again, first of all, what you can't control, what's beyond your ability. And I think, again, this is just a lesson in life. I mean, each of us as individuals live in a world where there are a lot of uncontrollables. Don't waste a lot of time on that. Be aware of it. It's part of the peripheral vision of life. You focus on what you can control. You focus on what you can do. And I tried to do that as well. Now, that's not easy either because you're dealing with the White House. You're dealing with the Congress. You're dealing with all these different countries. And you're dealing with your own internal issues. Plus, you've got outside crises and forces that are coming down on you. For example, first 5 days I was in the Pentagon, my Undersecretary for Finance came in and said, "We got some bad news, Mr. Secretary. Sequestration just went into effect. We're going to have to take a $50 billion, an additional $50 billion cut in the next 10 months. And there was no budget, no plans. Government shutdown a few months after that. Sexual assault issues that erupted and blew everything up. Cheating scandals in the nuclear groups. I mean, it was just one thing after the other. So you didn't plan for that, but you're the leader. You got to deal with it, and you got to put some time in. You can't delegate those kind of things, because only the leader can make the changes. And if you, in a big bureaucracy, something as big as the DOD, those changes will not be made unless the leader not only says it's going to happen, that's only part of it, but the follow-up.
You had a rocky relationship with the White House, as some use the term micromanagement by the White House over your policies. Is that a personality thing, or is it structural that basically anybody in your position in the future is going to have to deal with?
Well, two of my immediate predecessors, Bob Gates and Leon Panetta, both wrote books and talked about this. They had that as a big issue, and if you read any of their books or heard what they said, they've talked about this. Actually, they've talked about it more than I have. I don't think it's a personality thing. I think it is it's a couple of things. I think it's a structural issue within the White House, and I think it's a lack of experience in the White House. When you've got people in the National Security Council who don't have any experience, any real experience. Now they come out of think tanks, so on and so on. I mean, everybody has a role to play. There's even a place for lawyers. And
I'm going to come back to that.
But unless you've got some practical experience on how systems work, I mean, I'll give you an example, the micromanagement. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. We would get calls, and they'd never waste the president's time on this. The National Security Council, the president presides. The principals meetings, the National Security Advisor presides. And we would get the most insane, dumb questions all the time. Well, on a rescue mission or whatever. Well, I just want to make sure. Now, are you using dogs, or do you have enough helicopters, or do you have two pilots or one pilot? This is not the purview of the National Security Council. I mean, the Pentagon, the special operations people, and so on are the most professional people in the world. And by the way, I might add, the best educated. The Defense Department's senior leaders are better educated than any department in the government. PhDs, master's degrees, enlisted guys across the board have master's degrees. So these are not dumb people. They're smart people, they're experienced people, they know their business. And when you get into the third and fourth level of micromanagement, I'll never forget one day a general called me from Afghanistan and said, and Marty Dempsey was very upset about this, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was just a tremendous guy. And he came down to talk about it. He got in a call from a couple of people at the White House, the National Security Council, asking this, wanting immediately to talk to this general. Well, first of all, you don't do that. If there's some second or third level White House young staffer, you don't call a general in the field. You go through the process. You go through the Department of Defense. And the question he asked, he got the general out of a meeting and so on, was, I was just looking at the report, why are there only 2 strands of barbed wire around Bagram's outer perimeter, and shouldn't you have 3? Are you kidding me? This kid wouldn't even know what the hell barbed wire is. And he's, I mean, it's that kind of insanity that you put up with. And it's time consuming, it shows a lack of confidence. It's that kind of stuff. And so it's structural, it's a lack of experience. I said to the president one day, we were flying around, this is August of 2008, then Senator Obama asked Senator Jack Reed and me to go to the Middle East with him. I think Senator Obama had been in the Middle East once. And so I think we were 9 days. And Jack Reed and I are very close friends. And in fact, he and I came to the Senate together 20 years ago. He's from Rhode Island, West Point graduate. Actually got his Harvard degree, law school degree, I think here, Jack Reed did. and 12 years in the military, 82nd Airborne. I mean, knows what he's doing, and just terrific guy. So then Senator Obama asked us to go with him to all these countries, and we did. And we were flying around as we go from country to country. We're talking one day, the three of us, about the upcoming election. And I said to Senator Obama, I said, Barack, unless you screw this up, I think you're going to be elected. So he said, okay, smart ass, and if you're so smart about all this, what advice would you have for me? And I said, oh, Barack, I'm not near wise enough to give fancy presidents advice, but I said, there is one thing that you better start thinking about seriously, about people in your administration. And I said, the two most important jobs that you will decide on for your administration, they're all important, but two are particularly important: your chief of staff and your national security advisor. And he seemed puzzled with that, and he asked me why I said that. And I said, because DOD, State Department, any of the departments, they don't make policy. All the policy comes out of the White House. No policy is made without the president saying it's a policy. And those two are the funnels, National Security Council especially, that National Security Council advisor, for all national security foreign policy issues. So everything comes down that pike. Chief of Staff has obviously the whole range, but it watches over the Congress and more of the domestic piece. National Security Council advisor has more of the foreign policy and national security. I said, you've got to have two really experienced people in those jobs that understand it, and everything comes out of there, and they've got to have really good people around them. I think the model, the best I ever saw, I worked for 3 presidents, and I've known them all since Nixon, and worked with most of them, all of them in some capacity. But the best national security advisor and team I ever saw was George H.W. Bush's team. Brent Scowcroft was national security advisor. Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Jim Baker was Secretary of State. That's a pretty good team with experience in the whole thing. So I think it's a lot of those things. But
so let's talk about lawyers for a few minutes. A lot of our students want to go into government service and serve as lawyers. In your experience, are lawyers and sort of legal intervention, is that just generally annoying, or is it useful? Or maybe a different way of asking it, the extent to which legal advice really shapes policy decisions, and maybe within it, if there's a marked difference between what's considered domestic law, things like the War Powers Resolution or the AUMF or things like that, and international law, what is the justification to use force in Syria, et cetera?
Well, first of all, I know lawyers suffer a lot of lawyer jokes and so on, and a lot of it's deserved. I mean, that's, no profession is without that. But let's start with this. We are a nation of laws. And that's where I've always started from in my own thinking about a constitution. And that system allows us to self-correct like no other country in the world. We have 27 amendments to the Constitution, and we haven't gotten everything right, but we have a system that we can adjust and change and get things correct. Half the people in this room couldn't vote in this country 100 years ago, unless you were a white, male landowner at the beginning. All those rights guaranteed, enshrined in the preamble, they weren't there unless you were a white, male landowner. So my point is, lawyers are critical to any process because we always have to make policy, conduct ourselves within the framework of the law. You can overplay that, you can exaggerate that, you can use it as an excuse, you can defer tough decisions based on that. I get all that. But the legal dynamic of this is always important, and it I hope always will be. But also you can paralyze yourself too with too much legality, and I've always thought have to balance that with reality and common sense, and I've seen the evaporation of common sense an awful lot the last 20 years. The last 20 years, I've been in this business in some capacity. 12 years as a senator, then when President Obama came into office, he asked me to co-chair the President's Intelligence Advisory Board, which Rita Hauser was on with me. I did that for 4 years. It wasn't a full-time job, but it's a really critical job. I co-chaired that with Dave Bourne, who is now the president of the University of Oklahoma, the former governor of Oklahoma, and also chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was a Democrat, I was a Republican, and then being a Secretary of Defense for 2 years. So I've seen the variations of that. I was then in the Reagan administration and chief staff to a congressman. It doesn't mean I'm any smarter or better than anybody, but you form through those experiences some opinions on how to do things right and wrong. And so it depends really on the common sense and the judgment too. Yes, you got to stay within the parameters of legality. But I'll tell you what I've seen also happen, and I think this is right also and applies to the banking community, Wells Fargo being the latest, and I know we're not here to talk about banks, but it applies. We somehow, I think, unfortunately, in too many instances, crossed the ethical line, especially in public service, and now we play right on the legal line. Get away with as much as you can right up to the line of, am I indictable for this? Well, there is an outside boundary on that, but I don't think you should ever get that close to it in policymaking or public service. I think the real line should be ethics. And somehow we've blurred that and we've passed that line, I think, in many ways. And now we play on that line of legality. I think that's damn dangerous because it takes the humanity out of things. And you don't want a system that's all legal either. You want humanity in your system. And that's who America is as much as any country, at least that I've ever known. So there's a role, it's an important role, but it should always be balanced.
So we have time for only a couple questions before we need to clear the room. If you can state who you are and ask a brief question, I invite you to do so now. In the back.
Hi, sir. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carly Jim here. I'm a 1L. I'm wondering, Rosie and the Secretary of Defense will be coming in. Oh, sorry. Thanks. What sort of advice you would give them in terms of dealing with not only the successive and simultaneous crises that they'll be dealing with, but then also paying attention to the long-term priorities. As you mentioned, rebalancing to Asia is one of them, preventing sort of the growth of new terrorist groups across the world is another. How, as Secretary, would you guide them or give them advice to actually be able to deal with that issue?
First, I think each president, cabinet member, dean of a law school, any of us who have major responsibilities, has to first of all figure out what his or her own center of gravity is on how they want to lead and manage. And everybody's got a different style. But I think that has to be the first thing you do. I mean, you have to be true to yourself. I mean, we all are different. I pretty much now know what works for me. I mean, that's through a lot of mistakes. But I know kind of who I am. I mean, I don't know if anybody ever really knows completely who you are. I think we surprise ourselves all the time, no matter how old you get. But you know, you get to be my age and getting knocked down enough and enough experience, you kind of start to figure it out a little bit. But I think that's, first of all, figure out how you want to do your job. And you're going to get a lot of advice from everybody. I mean, you're going to be flooded with advice from everybody, every corner. Listen, but you've got to stay pretty close to your own inner core on who you are and what you believe. But listen. That's first. Turn those transmitters off and the receivers on. I think our foreign policy would be far better if we do that more often. Listen to people rather than talk all the time Second, I think you've got to, at least what I did, and I didn't invent this, but you've got to bring everybody in and build a team right from the beginning. Because if you don't do that, you will run into trouble in your own institution, especially the DOD. There are power bases in these empires within DOD that can stop damn near anything, because everybody has patrons on Capitol Hill.
And we haven't even mentioned the military-industrial complex.
We haven't even mentioned the military-industrial complex, and they are a big part of this. And the influence they have with congressmen and senators, oh boy. So you've got to kind of get that established first. You should have some sense of priorities, but I will guarantee you, the next Secretary of Defense, the next president, you've got to have some priorities. But just as I relayed to you all a few minutes ago when I first got there, I mean, I didn't know I was going to be faced with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all those things that I just mentioned. And those are just 5 or 6. I could mention another 5 or 6. I didn't have those on my priority list. But they're going to come. Those kind of things are going to come. So you've got to build enough time in your energy and your leadership and your schedule and your thinking to be able to absorb all that. I think, too, what I've always referred to as, and this is not just indigenous to Secretary of Defense or any other job, but everything. Make sure you have peripheral vision in everything you're doing, especially leaders. You've got to know what's going on around you. A lot of it you can't control, but you damn well want to know what's going on around you. And so keep that peripheral vision in some focus all the time, all the time. If nothing else, you don't get as many surprises that way. Another thing I used to tell my Senate staff, I said this to my Pentagon staff, just always remember there are no secrets. If you think you're going to get away with something, I mean, I don't have to tell you, America, emails and so on and so on and so on. Not in Washington, D.C. You've got bottom fishers all over that town all the time, just vacuuming up little things, little things, little things. And they become big things. I mean, look at the Anthony Weiner stuff. I mean, out of nowhere become, you know, a few days ago, boom. What? What's this now? Well, this was about this bizarre congressman from New York, wasn't it? And so on. Oh, boy. Now we've just kind of extrapolated. We're now moving out and Hillary Clinton stuff and his wife, and this is the way it happens. Many times in Washington, we bring our own problems on to ourselves because we do some dumb things. And, you know, I think those are basics, but then you've really got to also know as much as you can about the issues. The other part of that is, and I'll stop here, don't ever think that you're going to ever have enough time to know enough about every issue. You just won't. It's too big, too complicated, too many issues. And this is why you've got to rely on good people. Always, always surround yourself with good people. Pick the best people. And I've got 3 basic, I think, requirements that are prerequisites for leadership, starting with a president or any leadership position, but also it applies to the people you want around you. Character, courage, and judgment. The rest are just add-ons. I mean, experience is important, but every decision I've watched a president make, for example, when it comes down to the tough choices and the tough decisions, it comes down to his judgment. Now, he'll get all this input from all these smart people and so on and so on and so on. This is what I think you should do, Mr. President. Blah, blah, blah. In the end, he's the one sitting at that desk that has to make that call, and it's judgment. Now, you call upon your past experiences, of course, and your environment, your instincts, what you hear, your knowledge, and so on. But those are the 3 requisites. Make sure the people around you are of that quality.
Secretary, I wish we had 17 more hours to continue this conversation, but we need to clear the room for a constitutional law course. Thank you so much for your time and for your...
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, this was fun.